This afternoon, I'm in New Haven, sitting in the executive suite, I think is the term for this, at the Yale Law School Library. But I'm talking not with one of the Yale librarians at the moment, but rather with Kendall Svengalis, who lives and works here nearby in New Haven, Connecticut. Ken, in fact, you are the president of the New England Press at the moment. And many in my generation of law librarians will remember you as a longtime state law librarian of Rhode Island during a period when much of our industry was consolidating into what now I think is known essentially as Thomson Reuters. And you were an advocate for sort of a go slow approach to all this change and so on, as I recall, and make some rather articulate arguments that this might lead to consequences that we ought to be considering. And I think many of those, indeed, in retrospect, have occurred over the years. Well, with all that said, let me shift to something perhaps a little more interesting, and that is about you as a human being. Ken, could you tell us a little bit about your life perhaps today and even perhaps earlier when you were young or younger?
Okay. Well, I suppose it's best to start at the beginning. I was born in Gary, Indiana, a steel town about 30 miles from Chicago that was founded in 1906. My family, on my father's side, Lithuanian immigrants, came here in 1905, went to Waterbury, and then when they heard about the steel mills being built, beginning in 1906, they moved to Gary in 1908. So we go back, way back in Gary's history. Unlike some of the towns where I live now, Guilford, Connecticut was founded in 1639, so Gary was much...
They weren't making a lot of steel in this country at that time, were they?
That's right, but it was, when Gary celebrated its 50th anniversary, I thought that was a real long time, 50 years, now it's been another 50 years.
Scary, isn't it, to be around
right.
for both of those?
Yes. So I grew up, I was born May 16th, 1947. We lived in a multi-ethnic neighborhood with Poles, Lithuanians, Slovaks, Hungarians. I lived right next door to a Greek church. Catty corner from our house was a Hungarian church. Behind us were two Slovak churches. One was Eastern Rite, one was Catholic. Romanian was behind us, a block. I mean, we were surrounded by ethnic churches, and that's what I grew up in for my first 6 years. And then we moved to a suburb of Gary. And my early years were spent in the Gary schools. From there I went to Purdue University with the original intention of majoring in social studies education, which my brother had already pursued and was teaching social studies in Illinois. I thought I wanted to do that. I ended up switching my major to English, but I had minors in history and political science. I went to graduate school in history. Got my master's got my BA in 1970, my master's in 73. I wrote a thesis about the Gary school system and William Wirt, who was a very famous school superintendent in the first part of the 20th century, who created something called the work-study-play system of education. It basically signified a broadening of the curriculum from the old days when it was strictly reading, writing, arithmetic. Hands-on science and auditorium class, and the school had a zoo and an art collection and gardens that were operated by the botany students. It was very...
Sounds like a very interesting place.
Yeah, it was very revolutionary. And if you were to go back in the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature, in that period from, say, 1910 to 1920, you'll find more articles written about the Gary Public Schools than any other school system in the country. It was quite forward for its time. So I wrote about him, doing most of the research down at Indiana University at the Lilly Library, which has his papers. So I was very interested in that. And I've maintained an interest in Gary history since then. So I got my master's degree in 73 with the intention of getting a PhD and then teaching at the college level. So I got admitted to Brown University. I applied to about 5 or 6 schools out east, and Brown was my top choice, and I got admitted there. So I went to Brown, but when I got there, I realized at one of the cocktail parties for incoming students that also included people who had just gotten their PhDs the previous May. None of them had jobs.
Oh, the day of reckoning had arrived, huh?
One was painting houses, one was driving a cab, and one had a part-time job working somewhere, I don't know. But it looked very discouraging, and I was a steelworker's son. I had saved up enough for one semester's tuition working at U.S. Steel the previous summer, and I knew it was going to be tough. And if I didn't get a job at the end of it, I didn't see the point. But I had been thinking about library careers when I started, and I took a course called The History of the Book with one of the librarians at the, he was librarian at the John Hay Library. So that kind of got my feet wet in the area of bibliography. So I decided, by Thanksgiving of 1973, because that's when I moved out to Rhode Island, that I better look into the library school. Unfortunately, because I didn't plan this ahead of time, as to what was the fallback position, that there was a library school at URI.
You didn't have a plan B quite yet.
Right. Although I could have driven to Simmons in Boston, which would have been more expensive. URI sufficed, it was fine. And so I finished that degree in a little over a year. Just took a lot of intensive courses and finished up in a year. From there, I got a job at Roger Williams College at the time. It was not a university. All the colleges are now universities, so it was still a college.
I think it's an advertising thing or
That's
a prestige thing or something. You're right, they pretty well, in all the former community colleges, or junior colleges they call them then, are now community colleges, and some of them have dropped the name community because they're four-year places.
That's right.
That's right. There is growth or change or whatever.
Yeah. So I worked there for a semester, and as I was finishing up, a part-time reference position came up at Providence College, which was only about 6 blocks from where I lived. Because Roger Williams was about 20 miles away on the east side of the bay. So I got a job there, and that was a 20-hour-a-week job. It was an evening job. So I stayed there 2 years. In 1976, in March, I was hired as the assistant law librarian at the Rhode Island State Law Library. And I continued to work at Providence College evenings because we were saving money to build a house and buy some land, so I worked the 2 jobs for 1 more year. And then I dropped it, in the 2 years.
So being with your background with sort of conservative fiscal affairs, you didn't want to just go out and mortgage yourself up to the hilt, I guess.
Right,
Have a little up front to put into that structure.
Yeah, we were able to save enough to buy the land free and clear, and then that was our down payment at that time. You could build a house for $40,000.
Today's colleagues watching this will be shocked, even at that price, and we considered it extremely high at those days. Well, in any event, it sounds like you had sort of an interesting early career. Anything particularly you did in some of those early library positions before you went to the state law library that comes to mind?
Nothing
special?
Real specific. Although I enjoyed working with a general collection because I had a historical background, I was interested in literature, and I liked being in a broad-based collection of materials and helping students in various areas, rather than the focus for law. And, I did some writing. I got one article published while I was a graduate student at Purdue, and I'm sure that helped get me into Brown. But I just saw it as spending a lot of money and not, there was a glut of.
Well, you probably made a very sensible choice, and I mean, students today presumably are looking at some of the same questions when they decide if they, certain disciplines, including ours, law schools, are less attractive from the job placement perspectives than they were, a generation or even 10, 12 years ago.
Sure.
And the number of students is in fact down in a lot of the schools as a result.
Sure, sure. And if you look at the annual cost and the average debt of a law student, it's a pretty serious consideration, you know. And you see declining earnings for the average lawyer. A recent book was published that I reviewed for the Buyer's Guide. It falls by something like $64,000 to $46,000 in the last 20 years.
Well, even the ones that are much higher up in the economic group have seen a tremendous drop off in their firms' revenues, and essentially a refiguring on how many attorneys they needed to have to service their needs and could afford.
Right.
And, you know, partnerships and so on that used to be basically guarantees of forever employment no longer serve that kind of a purpose. There have been, you know, people even at the top levels have been essentially told it's, you know, this isn't working anymore. So one hears. And revenue streams are down even at the top. The clients are being a little more demanding of accountability for some of this stuff.
But I was very sensitive to the financial aspects of it, you know, and I was very fortunate because you think of the debt that students come out of college with today, and I went through, and my parents put me through with no debt, you know, at a time. But when my first semester at Purdue was $175 in the first semester tuition, you know. So things have changed a lot, you know. So, and I thank my parents because they were so eager for their two sons, you know, to get a college education, that they sacrificed a lot.
Well, you see that so much in the ethnic communities, especially those that, you know, didn't go back too many generations. They come over from the other country, they work hard, they get where they get, but the next generation or so goes much farther because of this sort of built-in incentive to do that kind of thing, and the willingness to do what it takes to make it happen, which you know you don't always see in a lot of the population anymore.
I was just thinking about in that regard, you know, as I said, my grandparents were in Lithuania and they were poor farmers, and then they went to Glasgow, Scotland, and my grandfather worked in a steel works in Glasgow, outside of Glasgow, and then went to Waterbury and worked for the brass industry, and then U.S. Steel, and worked at a powder plant, a munitions plant they had in Gary at that time. And then in the 30s, one of my uncles, who was born in 1916, went to Purdue, became a chemical engineer. So within the span of 30 years, 35 years basically, 1940, I think he graduated. You go from dirt poor peasant farmer to a graduate of a major university, you know, and that's what America is, you know, offered that opportunities.
Very much. Well, that sort of leads me to a question I like to ask, sort of to sum up you as a person, which we can do now, and that is, do you have any particular hobbies or other special passions that you do, presumably out of when you're not working on your other activities, your publications?
Well, my life is kind of balanced between my writing of the Buyer's Guide, updating it every year. That consumes me, you know, the first 4 to 5 months every year. Although I'm monitoring it, activities and happenings within the industry continually, most of the writing takes place within that period. During the other months, which this is one, my wife and I occasionally perform Swedish folk music. And in fact, about two and a half months ago, we performed at the reopening of the IKEA restaurant here in New Haven, and they wanted Swedish folk music, so we performed along with an accordion friend of ours, you know, in the restaurant. So we do that, and we perform at Swedish festivals and things like that. In fact, that's where I met my wife in Sweden, although she was from Stratford, Connecticut, which is next to Bridgeport.
Down
and
part of New York.
We met on a chorus tour of the American Union of Swedish Singers, which is a national organization, but the tour was open to anyone around the country who wanted to participate. And she signed up and I signed up. And we actually met in northern Sweden near the Arctic Circle in a hotel. We had not met before. So we do that. I've had a continuing interest in history and genealogy, and in particular on the history of Gary, Indiana, I did a history of Gary for its centennial in 2006. It's a coffee table book, 450 pages. I used old postcards, photographs, but it's also like 90,000 words of text talking about the neighborhoods and schools and
So it's
industry.
much more than just a picture book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So I wanted to combine the two and do a lot of research on the churches and the transportation system and everything. So that was a big project. My daughter helped me do all the layout for that. 3 years ago, I started writing. 3 years ago, I started writing SAT vocabulary building novels.
Ah.
The first one is called Conspiracy on the Housatonic, which is a river that runs in Stratford, Stratford and Milford. And in them, I feature my wife as this 17-year-old Swedish-American girl detective, Ellen Anderson. Her name was actually Anderson back in Sweden about 3 generations before, when she had a great-great-grandfather who was studying to be a tailor, and his master tailor said, Anderson is too common a name, because it's the son of Anders,
Yeah.
The name changed every generation anyway. And he said, come up with something different. So he came up with the name Halfling. So Ellen's great-grandfather, grandfather, and father were Halfling, and that was her name. But I didn't want to use the original name, so we went back to Anderson.
So they would know him by his name and identify that that was the guy to go to if you wanted your clothes altered or built from, or put together from the beginning, I imagine, too.
Yeah. So I wrote that in 2014, and then the sequel just came out in just last week actually, Wednesday, and it's called The Great Emerson Art Heist. So in this book, I wanted to get Ellen to Gary, Indiana, to my hometown, so I could write about Gary in a novelistic form. It's historical fiction. So her dad, who was a tool designer, has a war contract with an armaments manufacturer in Gary, and they take the 20th Century Limited to Chicago first, because it only stops 4 places along the way, and then come back to Gary on the South Shore. And on the train, she meets a Russian woman who's escaped from the Soviet Union. And she's headed to Gary because her uncle, who had been in the White Russian Army, is living in Gary, working in the steel mills. And they meet and talk, and their lives and story kind of mesh, and they both become embroiled in a mystery. And so that one just came out. And they're a lot of fun, and the first one has 1,500 SAT words in it. The second one has 2,187, I think, SAT words in the text. They're bold, with a glossary in the back. So that's been a real fun project, writing about that. And I illustrate them with old postcard images, old photographs. If I'm talking about her riding on a trolley, I find an old trolley photograph from Gary and use that. Used the yearbook photos of the teachers. She goes to my high school. So that's been great fun.
So you met your wife actually in Sweden, sort of north. Is travel part of your activities these days, or was that just sort of a special trip?
Well, I've been to Sweden 6 times, and that leads into another one of my passions, and that is the tenor Jussi Björling, who was a Swedish tenor, sang at the Met for 20 years, 22 years, until his untimely death in 1960. And I've been a member of the Jussi Björling Society since it was started in 1997. I'm now the vice president of it. And I've been there 3 times for Björling-related events. I went for his 25th, it was his 75th birthday in 1986. And then in 2004, we had a conference there. And then in 2011, his centennial was held in Sweden. And we attended the centennial concert at the Royal Opera in Stockholm with the King and Queen in attendance.
That must have been quite a treat.
That was really fun.
Yeah.
And we had a 3-day conference, 2 days in Stockholm, 1 day in his birthplace where his museum is. And I brought my children over, my son and daughter, who grew up listening to Jussi Björling and opera recordings, and indoctrinated them from an early age.
Dad had them on,
Yeah, and I had to have them there for this event. So I brought them over, and my son-in-law, and my daughter was pregnant with my granddaughter, so she was there too. So they got to all sit in the orchestra with me. The King and Queen were right up in the balcony, right to the side of us, you know.
That must have been a treat in its own right. I can think of the movie Amadeus and some of the scenes with the nobility or the emperor in the audience, and I don't know how much of that's fiction and how much is real, but it was a fun thing to watch, and that with the ruler of the country, Austria, being a part of that, was part of it, and I know that Mozart was indeed in the roles that movie talked about him being in, vis-a-vis the archbishop and then the emperor and so on. That was interesting. Well, it was a way for him to make a living, as you say. You got to be practical in this world.
So actually, of the times I've been to Sweden, I guess it's 6. Only the first time I went in 1976 was just purely travel. Every other one has been either a UC Berlin conference or a Swedish choral tour. So that's really what's brought us there. But oftentimes what happens is we'll go over for 10 days in advance before the tour starts or the Berlin conference started, and we visit our relatives, and they just love having us, and they put us up and feed us, and you don't have to spend a dime on food or housing. It's great.
Yeah, it would be appalled if you didn't take advantage of their hospitality.
That's right.
Sure. Yeah. Well, sort of focusing a little more back on your career now, Ken. 1976, the bicentennial year of the United States of America. You started as the assistant, I guess, at the Rhode Island State Law Library, and then about 6 or so years later, in 1982 or so, you moved up to State Law Librarian. Could you tell us a little bit about, before we begin talking about the library, with all these various interests and so on, I didn't see a compelling indication you were going to be a law librarian, but somewhere along the way, maybe it was just happenstance, you ended up in our field, or our niche of the broader library field. Can you tell me about how that all came about, and maybe even if somebody played any kind of a role in helping you come to that decision? Who that was?
Well, it was really happenstance. I would check the job listings while I was working part-time at Providence College, and there was an opening for an assistant law librarian at the Supreme Court. There was also an opening at one of the law firms, but I decided to apply. I don't think I applied for that job. I only applied for the one at the State Law Library. And I thought it would be a nice fit because of my historical background, my history studies, my political science background, even though I didn't have a law degree. So it was, if a job had opened up at URI or one of the colleges, I might have ended up there, but it just worked out that way.
But this was the first of the two that came along, and you got it. So
that's
there you were.
Yeah, and I think about how different things would have been, if the publishers didn't have this scourge, on their backs. If I had landed a job at some university general collection library, something that didn't go into law.
On the other hand, who knows? Maybe someone else would have carried the torch or something. Whatever. Well, you were actually there. My notes indicate until around 2002 when you retired after 26 years at the State Law Library. That's by itself a major career in its own right. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of that experience at the library?
Well, like I say, I was hired in '76. My first 6 years there was a learning experience. I was basically self-taught. I just read a lot and taught myself the law. I hadn't taken a course in law librarianship. Later, before my boss retired, Virginia Wise was teaching the course, been teaching a course at Simmons, and they asked her to teach a course at URI, through URI. And she asked if she could use our library, which would be a better location, a little more central, because a lot of the students were from the general Providence area, rather than driving to southern Rhode Island. So I kind of helped her out, and I sat in on her classes. So that was my first experience of going through a course in law librarianship. I think she only taught it one time. I'm a little fuzzy on that, but But then when she decided she didn't want to do it, by that time I had become the state law librarian and they asked me to teach it. And so I began that in I think '85 and started teaching the course about every second or third semester when they had sufficient demand for it as a specialty course within the whole
Sounds like they had a fair amount of demand if you were teaching it that frequently, because
Well-
you know, it's not mainstream library science. So.
Yeah, yeah. It was generally, though, the class generally hovered around 10. The
Uh-huh.
first time I offered, I think there were 22 in the class because there was a little backlog of people that thought, oh, because Roger Williams University Law School was opening up and they were anticipating job openings there. So I think that led to them being
So they were
increased
planning
demand.
ahead for, hopefully, it would be well worth planning ahead for.
Right, and at least one of my students is still working there, actually.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So, but generally speaking, or in some ways, the experience was not great because my predecessor, who I worked under for 6 years, was a high school graduate who had worked there for like 30 years until he was finally promoted, you know.
Yeah.
And there was natural, I think he felt threatened by someone with a degree. I mean, he didn't have an undergraduate degree,
Yeah.
you know, and I was very accommodating, but he didn't see the point in cataloging the collection. I mean, the basic things that we would do.
His
you know.
era, arguably everybody knew you had at least the local and probably federal codes and maybe the court reports for the local Supreme Court and at least the higher level of federal courts, maybe a few statutes. So, everybody knew you had them and they weren't that hard to find in some of the collections of that era of the size they were. So maybe he was right. He didn't need to know how to catalog, but of course, as we got more diverse in what we were collecting and it got larger, that sort of changed.
Right, right. And I also saw the fact that what we were weak in was in the area of legal treatises.
Mm-hmm.
And he tended to buy, and this gets into some of the, and I could be anticipating maybe your future question, but he tended to buy a lot of Matthew Bender publications. And he
Okay.
bought a lot of CCH loose leaf services. And that was driven very much by the salesman.
Yeah.
And the salesman, of course, got their commissions from
Oh, yeah.
not only the sales, but the renewals.
And fairly substantial ones, because
Right.
those were very pricey items and tended to have a very, shall we say, short shelf life.
Right.
Before you had to renew and keep them up to date and
Right.
replace them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when I started, when I was appointed law librarian in 1982, we had some severe budget problems, and I was told I had to cut 10% out of the budget in March. So it was late in the year, and it was very difficult to do that. So I did it initially by surveying the use of the CCH services and found that a lot of them were rarely used, if ever. And we were maintaining these collections that were costing hundreds of dollars at that time for no purpose. Nobody was using them. So we asked the lawyers, not to reshelve them, to put them on a truck, and we were recording every usage of them to try to find out what we could eliminate without any effect at all. Now, in the case of the Matthew Bender treatises, it's a very interesting story because the salesman didn't get anything on the renewals.
Oh.
And I can still remember this guy, his name was Reese Butler. He was trying to encourage my boss to cancel and then repurchase, which is what I later promoted. But my boss was very timid about that. He didn't want to upset anybody and rock any boats. So he said, the reason he's doing that is because he makes a commission on that. So he was suspicious of it, and I understood that. But it also benefited the library because it made me start to analyze, why are we spending all this money on supplements to secondary sources? And that became kind of a fundamental part of my thinking about evaluating the value of treatises that are supplemented quarterly. Like most federal practice.
What is it that's so different about one quarter to the next in those? Exactly.
Right.
Other than the amount you were paying the publisher.
Yeah. And in addition to that, the fact that when the supplements came out, and I would track this, the material in it was about 9 months old when you got it.
Mhm.
So what's the point of supplementing quarterly when the latest material, the latest cases cited are 9 months old? So that provided a wide avenue for a reduction in costs. And that got us through that year, but then it became a systematic process.
Yeah.
And not only that, but canceling the subscriptions and left us with sets that we could dispose of, and I would give them away to lawyers. You know, we didn't even try to sell them, we would just offer them to lawyers if they had a specialty, and it made a lot of lawyers very happy. You know, they could have an older set,
Well,
but we were discarding
They
it.
had the basic stuff they needed, presumably, in them. They'd have to, whatever they read, even a brand new out of the postal package the week before is, 9 months out of date already.
Right.
You had to check it, so why not check from a little bit older?
I know, that's
Yeah.
right, yeah. And so that was instrumental in my thinking, you know, that,
Well, you developed some very serious thinking about taking a hard look at the legal publishing business of that era, and even this one, I'm sure, too. Because you started putting together a lot of this information, sort of on a broader scale than just Matthew Bender, and published at some point, the first edition of the Legal Information Buyer's Guide and Reference Manual, which is currently in its 20th edition.
20th edition,
Yeah, it just came out this year, so this is not something you've let go.
right, that's right.
But that, I remember, you were sort of the Bible to a lot of us on exactly why our budgets were tracking the way they were.
Right, yeah.
And, it was very helpful.
And that, you know, the origins of that, going back to my own experience, you know, and really, I guess the origin of that can go back to my thinking about growing up in a family living paycheck to paycheck. My parents never saved more than $1,000 at any one time, and my dad would tend to take it out of the bank. My mother would save it scrupulously, you know, for weeks, wanting some degree of security, and my dad would take it out and buy an antique or something, you know. He'd spend half of it, and it was a source of tension.
A nice
you know.
little purchase in his mind, and not so much in your mother's mind.
Right, right. And once he bought a truck, because it was I can remember it was the era of, in the early 50s, when we were talking about nuclear war, you know, and
He was going to have his
he
getaway
was going to
vehicle.
have a getaway truck,
Yeah.
and he'd load us up and drive us out to the country. And he bought that when we were still living at the place where I was born. He didn't keep it long, but that was a little bit of that money that my mother had saved, and it happened periodically, and so I was very sensitive to finances, and I felt my mother's pain in that regard about not having sufficient resources. So I knew we kind of lived from paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
So that was my mindset when I went into buying law books, and I also felt a strong sense that these were taxpayer dollars, and we had to spend them wisely, and I wasn't going to waste them. So I was very strict about how we spent money, and yeah.
Do you ever deal with some of the traveling sales reps for things like periodicals, Fred Dennis, some of the other?
I never encountered them.
Yeah, I
you
know they work the academic market, but I think we were needing to fill in gaps in legal periodicals and some of the old reports and so on, probably more than you did. But they were another study that was interesting to watch operate. A few of them. One of them, Fred Dennis, who was actually one of probably the oldest in terms of these guys. I had a boss once who used to describe him as such a good salesman that he could come into your office, sit down, and proceed to sell you the paint off your own wall. It was that good.
Yeah.
But, it was a visit periodically that did tend to, you had to keep an eye on the purse strings.
Right, right.
Yeah.
No, my only experience with dealers in periodicals or anything else, other materials, was Dick Spinelli.
Okay.
You know, my contact with Hine.
Well, when Spinelli came along, it was a whole new breed.
Right.
very different approach.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think the right sense of that
Yes.
difference.
That's right.
Yeah.
But my interest in cost-effective acquisitions was an outgrowth of this interest in Matthew Bender, starting with Matthew Bender. We had a program, our state law library sponsored an Law Libraries of New England meeting in 1985 in Newport. And it was one day on cost-effective acquisitions. The second day was on products liability law. And I gave a talk about cost-effective acquisitions. And I can remember Maria Sekula sitting in the front row, probably next to Edgar Bellefontaine.
Yeah, from the social law library.
From the social law library in Boston, right.
Mhm.
And they were kind of movers and shakers, within the association
Yes.
and law librarians of New England in particular. And Maria said, "Oh, you should publish that in LLRD News." And I hadn't thought of that, but I said, "Okay." And so I published it there. And then as a result, other newsletter editors who would exchange newsletters asked to reprint it, and it got reprinted, I don't know, a number of times in other regional newsletters.
Yeah, ALL used to collect all the newsletters and then send them out, or there was a way of distributing them so that everybody did get all the others.
Okay,
Which was nice, a nice source of interesting articles sometimes.
yes, right. So then it was an outgrowth of that. And then I got involved with the Committee on the Relations with, it was CORPUD, Committee on Relations with Publishers and Dealers, was the
Okay.
original predecessor to CRIB, or the Committee on Relations with Information Vendors.
Yeah,
And I got involved with that. And then when it became CRIB, I became the first CRIB editor of the CRIB sheet.
Uh-huh.
And that went on from 1988 to 1994. And in fact, I did it longer than anybody else. In fact, Penny Hazelton finally called me up and said, "We really need to appoint somebody else," because they wanted more turnover in the job. I was happy doing it.
or maybe a certain constituency within the group wanted a different approach by the editor. He was being a little too hard on them, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think, although I don't know specifically, but I think she may have gotten some feedback from publishers, about some of my articles.
No doubt.
Yeah.
But,
So-
that was your right.
Right,
Yeah.
that's right.
And probably was, you were speaking truth to, I don't know if they call themselves power.
Power,
or
yeah.
whatever. Yes.
Yeah, so,
Well, you have had a long history of dealing with, including some of the touchier issues that have come up with especially as the industry has consolidated under fewer and fewer owners
Right.
and so on, and you've had, strong opinions, well put. You want to talk any at all about some of what you saw in that day and at that time?
well, it was coincidental that I decided to, after I finished editing the crib sheet, that I would do a book for lawyers on how to buy law books.
Mm-hmm.
And I started working on it in about January of 1995. And as I was finishing it up, I think it was either November or December of 1995, was the announcement that West was putting itself up on the market.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a result, when the book came out, I think I just had the galleys in my hands
Mhm.
when I got a call from, and now his name escapes me, but this guy that worked with a project in Washington, D.C. It'll come to me later, but he was calling a meeting with the Justice Department, the Antitrust Division in Washington, and Bob Oakley was at that meeting.
Yeah.
And
Our association's Washington Affairs rep, Bob.
that's right. He
And
was-
also a head librarian at Georgetown.
That's right. So it was convenient for him, and it was Alan, and the name will come to me later, but we met, I guess it was at the Justice Department, and there were probably 5 or 6 law librarians there, and 3 or 4 Justice Department attorneys. And I started quoting to them the percentage of the market that West would control, the new conglomeration, Thompson West would control. And they said, what are you reading from? And I told them that I'd just done this book, you know. And so they were my first customers as the Justice Department. So it was very fortuitous that it came out at that time. And then they had me back again. They flew me down there to talk further about the nature of the merger.
Yeah.
And what I saw was I had analyzed, in fact, I was doing the calculations on the plane coming down for that first meeting. And I was looking at the percentages that Thompson West would control in certain subject areas, municipal law and criminal law and so forth. And there were a number where they would have had 75 to 80% of the market. And I thought, this is really untenable. It's going to give them too much power. And,
Yeah.
but you know, ultimately it didn't hinge on that. It hinged more on the whole idea of pagination and the electronic world. And in my view, they didn't demand sufficient divestment of product.
Yeah.
And I had a problem with them capturing both the National Reporter System, the American Digest system, and Lawyers Co-op's Total Client Service Library system,
Yeah.
which were marketed as separate systems of legal information, and I thought it was wrong. I mean, from one sense, from a researcher's point of view, it's kind of nice that those are all run by one company, you
Sure.
know. But from the consumer's point of view, it gives them too much control.
Yeah.
And I thought they should have divested themselves of more of the titles, and the divestiture list was only about 51
It was
titles.
very short.
Yeah, and a lot
Some
of them were,
things left on that they could keep that seemed sort of odd because they would have been natural. I mean, they were such direct competitors themselves, these publications.
yeah, I mean, they had to divest USCS and USCA,
Yeah.
although they got to keep both the legal encyclopedias.
Yeah, Amger and CJS
and
were, I
CJS.
mean, that's what I was sort of just thinking about. 'Cause
Right.
one would have thought one would go someplace else and they'd have their choice of which one
Right,
to keep.
yeah.
But you know, the industry, from my sense, what I thought I saw before then, wasn't that competitive even then. You had sort of the rumors, I'll use that word, of a so-called gentleman's agreement back in maybe around the 1940s, where they divvied up who would do what. And so West put out the reports, the comprehensive set. If you
Right.
wanted everything, you went to West. If you wanted a selective group, but not everything, Lawyers Co-op with their series. And you had a lot of other sort of books that worked very well with those of other companies. And it wasn't until the 70s when Lexus came along that suddenly you had what was a form for a while and then became very real competition for the West Reporter System.
Right.
Somebody putting out all the same stuff, but in a different format.
That's right.
So the industry, when the consolidations began and continued, arguably may not have been that competitive at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly at the very end, with the ownerships consolidated into a handful of players, I suppose arguably not at all competitive, although they're much more competitive with each other now, I think, than the companies tended to be in the early days even.
I guess my attitude at the time, and when I came to the ALL board meeting in '96 and we discussed it, it was that for strategic purposes, at least, I thought the association should oppose the merger, and that would force, at least put further pressure on the Justice Department to force more divestitures and split up the amount of information that was controlled. But, you know,
20/20 hindsight,
I know.
Perhaps it could have happened that way. Who
Yeah.
knows, I guess. But
you know, it's
the
funny if you go
the
back.
past is now our history. So
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, and when you look at the articles at the time, and I knew it was all fluff, but you know, one of the executives at West was saying, "Oh, we have no plans to raise prices," you know.
somebody did a quick analysis of whatever they were paying. It was going to take like 20 years or something to break even unless they did raise prices, and
Right.
we didn't think any organization in a money-making venture called a business that was gonna wanna wait that long to.
Right. And
More
you know
than
why
break
they bought it, because it's, first they're selling to a professional market, and they're selling supplemented materials. All their money is made off of supplements.
Oh, yeah.
So
So
they
wonderful,
gotta
you
raise
buy the
prices.
first volume, you gotta then keep it up to date,
Right.
or buy the next volumes that
Yeah.
come along.
That's right, that's the whole nature of it.
And they didn't even have to pay the judges who were writing all these nice opinions for them.
Yes, right.
That they could then publish and charge accordingly for.
Yeah.
A pretty good deal, huh?
Yeah,
Yeah.
And the fact, that lawyers are really a captive market, and and I can say from experience, trying to tap that market and try to teach them about the practices of legal publishers is pretty much a lost cause.
Yeah.
Because my market is almost all law libraries, and the only time lawyers gain access to the information in my book is because they have a law librarian who understands those things and buys it on their behalf and uses it on their behalf. But lawyers, I've had very few, maybe a dozen, that have bought it over the years. In 20 years I've been publishing it. And even though we've done test marketing in different states, and the legal publishers know that, that when a lawyer needs something, he's not going to quibble about how much he pays for it. Although there is resistance that has happened to the cost of supplementation, because one of the other things I wrote about in the late 1980s, early 90s, was when there were massive cancellations of Matthew Bender publications because of their price increases. There was a period of about 5 years, one of the articles I did, in which they raised prices about 25% 3 of those years, and about 18% the other 2 years. So when that was happening, I get a call from a guy named Phil Carter, who worked for Matthew Bender. He was one of the vice presidents at Matthew Bender. I don't know if he's still alive. And he called me up and he told me what was happening. And he saw the company was driving itself over a cliff. He says, we can't survive this. This can't go on. They were trying to satisfy, the stockholders and produce good returns,
Sure.
on the short term, not realizing that they were killing the golden goose, that they were. And in some cases, and I don't have the exact figures here, but the number of subscribers to Moore's Federal Practice was over 20,000, probably 25,000. It fell to less than 10,000 over a 5-year period, or from say the mid-'80s until the early 90s. And so I wrote about that, and then their president was booted out, and they brought in a temporary president. It was a guy named Alex Sann, S-A-N-N, and he had 2 confabs with law librarians. One was at a hotel in Manhattan, and the other one was up at a hotel in Vermont. I can't remember the town right now, but I remember Kara Billings went to the meeting in Vermont, and Ed Edmonds and I and a number of other people were at the meeting in New York. And Alex Sann sat across from me at this this conference table, and he said, everything you wrote about us was correct. So that was kind of a great vindication.
An interesting statement against interest, but reality.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was kind of like, I guess I kind of viewed myself as the boy who sees the emperor with no clothes and is willing to say so. And here they acknowledged it. Their president acknowledged it, and then they froze prices for a few years.
Yeah.
Completely before starting to raise them slightly, and they tended to raise them at levels of around 5 or 6%. But that's all changed in the last couple of years. They're back to their old ways.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Ken, because up until the recession that hit in about 2008, the legal profession was a potential spigot wide open for this sort of thing. I mean, the firms were raking in billable hours and billing basically almost what they wanted.
Right.
That all changed rather dramatically, and the world is a new world for the practice of law as well as law libraries in a broader sense. So you would think that up until then there would be a lot less incentive to rein in prices if you could get away with it, and then there is today. But
Right.
it sounds like some of them are back to the old pattern, I guess, of keeping the shareholders happy
Yeah, yeah,
at everybody else's expense if need be.
right. I mean, in recent years, I would say pretty much since the merger, West has pretty much been raising prices at about 11.5 to 12% a year.
Yeah.
I mean, if your budget is going up 3%, or maybe your budget's being cut.
Your
it's
budget may be
devastating.
going in the other direction in
Right.
this day and age.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
then-
I suppose that the fact that so many could substitute Westlaw for paper, and they were used to paying for something for both,
Right,
maybe that's given them at least a temporary reprieve on some sort of day of reckoning, perhaps. Because the savings of dumping the reporters or the paper has sort of covered perhaps some of the increases in other places.
right.
We will
right.
see.
But there are limits to that, because once you cut those things,
Yeah.
now
You don't have it again.
you can't do that again.
Yeah.
And we've seen at least the last 2 years, Matthew Bender's supplementation costs, both for the print or the online versions, have been going up 20% a year.
Well, that's pretty substantial.
yeah.
I mean, that's arguably unsustainable, I would
Yeah,
think.
yeah. And I don't know how much longer they can keep doing it. And I tracked it in my last 2 editions. I put in a table showing the increase in cost of West publications versus Matthew Bender publications. I just pick on those two, and I show them for more than a 20-year period. And so I show the total percentage increase and what the average annual increase is. And it's risen substantially for Matthew Bender now. So I don't know what's going on there, except they see what West has been able to get away with its customers, and they raised it even more.
Well, executives have a huge built-in incentive given to them to maximize returns to the shareholders.
Right.
That may be part of what's, shall we say, influencing their current thinking, just
Yeah.
as it did some years ago, presumably. And the period in between, when they sort of cut back for a while and acknowledged, oh, mea culpa, may have been forgotten in
Yeah.
today's world.
Yeah,
And maybe the cycle will repeat, who knows,
yeah.
for some of them.
Yeah, it's one reason why I'm kind of glad I'm not in law libraries. It's nice to be retired now, not have to deal with the practicalities of what do you do with the National Reporter System, which has also, been increasing. Like, for instance, the advance sheet's been going up 20% a year for years now.
Well,
And
yeah, but as I said, many of our colleagues have eliminated paper, but
Right.
that hasn't meant they've eliminated the content. They're getting it in another format.
that's right. Yeah,
Obviously, the price is probably increasing there as much or even perhaps more.
but you wonder who's sustaining those publications, because any sensible person would cancel all that paper.
Yeah. Well, I know that a lot of the large firms did cancel paper, not so much because of the subscription prices, but the cost of the space and
Right.
providing that, especially in a metropolitan area with high rents and costs and so on.
That's
But,
right.
it was. Now, with all this history of, shall we say, keeping our friends on the publishing side, at least under the spotlight. I was going to say keeping them honest, but I won't go that far. Although hopefully you did, or we did. Here you are. If I look at the latest online version of ALL's directory, you're listed as a vendor and a
Right.
provider of services. You and the New England Law Press.
Right.
How do you find this sort of change of hats, or is it a real change of hats for you?
Well, I mean, I kind of consider myself a law librarian who's also a vendor. I only do one book, and that book is to help law libraries. So I guess I consider myself a different breed. For instance, there are other law librarians who have gone into publishing that have, for instance, taken advertising. I can think of, Donna Tukey Heroy did a legal information alert. She's now gone out of business, she decided to do other things.
Okay.
But she took the advertising. I will never accept advertising, because always want to be perceived as being completely objective. I don't want to have any conflict with having taken any advertising. So, you know, I mean, that could be lucrative, you know, but I won't do it.
Well, Consumer Union does the same thing with their consumer reports, and they pride themselves on the independence that they say they have.
Right. Yeah. So I do have to deal with those things. And what's interesting is being a vendor is dealing with librarians who sometimes don't engage in the best practices vis-a-vis their vendors. For instance, people who have things on a standing order will sometimes cancel or send something back that's on standing order. My print run is based on their standing order, but they'll say, oh, well, we decided we didn't want this, and they'll do it after the fact.
Yeah, so you
and I
have
made
to front the money for it, and you don't get anything back.
Right, right. And you pay the postage, you know, to ship it to them and all that.
Sure.
But, I mean, when I was a law librarian, if I had anything on standing order, I would never send it back. I would just cancel it going forward. I would never send something that, you know, it's just unfair to the publisher. So librarians also have to be, have to have certain scruples about how they deal with publishers and be honest and forthright with them, and not just treat them all as if they're fat cats, because they're not all. You know, I'm certainly not. You know.
Well, I mean, we're sort of a small market potentially compared to other markets for publications. I mean, the law market has got to be relatively small.
Right.
So you're right, it's fixed. You plan accordingly, and you don't need, given the small nature of the field, you don't need any sudden surprises really thrown at you.
Right, right. In the current economy, you know, I've seen a number of cancellations from people who I know they're hurting. You know, they're local county law libraries and some academics. Mostly academics have been the most solid customers, though. But some firms will buy the book for many years, and then there's a change in leadership. You know, there's a new director, and they don't perceive or have a history of its value. You know, so you have to get used to that. And that's
Or the
that's
lawyer's
part of
practice
business.
shifts a little bit, or whatever, on some books, and that, you know, that dictates changes in the library as well. And that's always been the case, of course.
Right.
It's not new.
Right. So it's been interesting, you know, being a vendor, and you know, we do it all. My wife helps me, you know, do bookkeeping, and you know, it's basically a two-person operation, you know. And she does all the layout for me. She's a computer programmer, so it's a nice.
Sounds like you complement each other nicely.
Yes, in both music and in publishing.
She can tolerate the same music you like. Well, that's important, you know. Actually,
She's not as big an opera fan as I am. But she likes Swedish folk music, so we have a real common interest in that and choral music.
Okay,
So,
well, you can pick and choose from your passions on music and accommodate her desires as well. I'm sure there. Well, we've talked about, you know, sort of your business now and your sort of background professionally and involvement with the publishing world in terms of taking a look at what's going on and how it manifests itself in costs to law libraries and other customers. Can we focus a little bit on some of your professional involvement over the years beyond that? I know you were active in ALL's CRIV and predecessor and other things, but I noticed that in getting ready for today, you've been active in other organizations as well. Specifically, I'm aware of the fact that you served a term as president of the Law Librarians of New England, which is the chapter here of ALL in this part of the country. We're in Connecticut, so I guess that's New England. You've served on the board of the State Court County Law Librarians Special Interest Section, also of ALL. We've mentioned the crew sheet editors, and I was looking quickly at some of these. And I want to ask you about that, but before I do, I want to mention that you have been recognized for some of this service with the Connie Bolden Significant Publications Award, which is the highest honor. You've gotten it twice from the State Court and County Law Librarian Special Interest Section.
That's right.
And you were cited for that once for the, you were the first editor of Proof Sheet, I guess. You didn't get the Connie Bolden Award for that, but it was the composite, I guess.
Right, that's right.
Of all the things you do. And you have received the ALL's own recognition for a publication, the highest recognition that we give, which is the Joseph L. Andrews Bibliographical Award, which you received in 1998 for Legal Information Buyer's Guide and Reference Manual, the 97-98 edition. So you certainly had some recognitions, which I consider certainly considerable and significant. And I hope you do
I'm
too.
very proud of that, in particular the Joseph Andrews Award.
Yeah, but you've done a lot for our profession, both for ALL and other organizations. You want to talk a little bit about some of that, and perhaps even hazard a reason as to why you considered it important enough to devote time, which has got to be scarce, like it is for everyone.
Right.
Devote some of your time to doing.
Well, I think first I was asked to run for treasurer of law librarians in New England. I served in that capacity for a year, and then was asked to run for president, and ran several of our regional meetings, and found that a nice springboard to then getting involved with the with CORPOD, the Committee on Relations with Publishers and Dealers, that then became CRIV. And then at the same time I was doing that, I was on the state court and county board. CRIV involved a lot more time and effort than the others. And then in the early 90s, I served as president of, well, first I was the vice president-elect of the New England Law Library Consortium. And we had just become a member, the state law library had just become a member of the consortium, as did the other state law libraries in New England.
I know,
There's the 6. And I was the first non-academic who was asked to be president, run for president. So that was an honor, but also a little intimidating, because I'm dealing with all these academics and trying to, a lot of the issues were driven more by the academics than by the state court and county libraries.
Yeah.
So that was a challenge, but fun, and we did some, we had some, meetings where we tried to focus in on what our mission should be in terms of storage of materials, joint acquisitions, to try to save costs, because it was originally driven by the deans of the law schools in New England.
Yeah, library being a potential bottomless pit for resources.
Right.
Yeah.
So, being in that role was a bit of a challenge, because I had to become much more attuned and aware of the academic issues driving things. The chief benefit to us was, of course, being able to tap for interlibrary loan purposes the resources of all those academic libraries, which we didn't abuse, but we were able to use them.
No, but I understand. Why not? It's as you say, the taxpayers' money. You have to use it prudently.
Right.
Sometimes these arrangements are a prudent use of resources.
Yeah. So it was a natural outgrowth of my interest in cost-effective acquisitions, was also resource sharing in doing that. So I followed Edgar Belafontaine on one side, and then Terry Martin followed me, so I was in pretty good company.
You had sort of a fancy, he's not a county law librarian, it's a social library, social law library, but he's sort of more like a bar library, I guess.
That's right, he was a bar
with
library.
Ed, and then,
very
of course
significant.
Terry at Harvard
That's right.
was
Terry
the
Martin.
other end of the other spectrum.
Yes.
It must have been an interesting, you were in the sandwich section.
Right,
Between
that's
them.
So as my service on the New England Law Library Consortium ended is when I was starting to work on the Legal Information Buyer's Guide.
Okay.
And once I started doing that, I kind of came to the sense that this was going to have to be my contribution, because that became very time consuming.
Must have been tremendously, and I mean, in your library, you must have had to get access to a lot more information than you might have normally needed to just do your library work and make decisions. You must have had to have a much wider variety of pricing information and other practices.
Right, yeah, having that access.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would, spend my evenings and weekends and working on that book, and I'd stay after hours, to review the books in my library, and yeah, it grew. It's probably double the size as when I started, because I started out with I think it was 500 and some pages, with a larger, I think it was a 12-point font, and I shrunk it down to 10. It's
Now,
grown.
don't go any farther like that, or some of our more elderly eyes
I
are gonna
know,
have
I
trouble.
know. And one of the things I naturally have to deal with is as the buyer's guide grows, you not only have to add new information, but you've got to update a larger body of information. Because every edition, I have to update all the bibliographical information, all the pricing, and then add the new supplementation costs, because I track that. And that's very time consuming, is tracking that supplementation cost. And that's one thing that nobody else has done, is systematically track the supplementation costs for all those years. And I want to keep doing it, but I often say to myself, how much longer I'm 69, how much longer do I want to keep doing this? Maybe another 5 years, and then try to find somebody I can
Eventually
pass it
it'll
on
be
to.
not our watch anymore, so if the younger generation doesn't step up, that's not our watch anymore again.
Right, at some
Yeah.
point, But
Yeah.
I think it's something that needs to be there,
Yeah.
so that people can get a firm handle on when they contemplate a publication. They not only have a description of it from an objective point of view, but they have the whole history of the supplementation cost. And that's one of the things I've never done. I haven't taken out any of the earlier supplementation costs. I just left it in there. So it goes back to 1995, or in some cases 93 if I had it. So it's 23 years worth of
Yeah,
supplementation.
it's useful in budget planning and trying to justify the needs. I mean, it graphically points out what we as the user law libraries actually need to maintain the levels that our users have been accustomed to. So, when the budget people see that, I think it's more persuasive. It doesn't necessarily carry the day, because times are tough for them too, but
Right.
at least we go into it with our eyes wide open.
Yeah.
And, the result is whatever it is, and we all live with it, but it's for the right reasons.
Yeah. And it's not always easy to get. Some of the publishers are very cooperative in providing supplementation cost information. And actually, even though vendor has been increasing its prices significantly in the last few years, they're very cooperative in providing me with all the data.
Well, maybe it isn't hurting them to have that out
I
or
know.
something, I don't know.
But West has never cooperated with me.
Oh.
They will not. So, but I will say on their behalf that their website provides the ability to gather the supplementation cost information, and then that if you're a subscriber, and that's the pricing that I use, if the supplementation cost is listed as $200, the subscriber cost is going to be 20% less than that, generally speaking. With some of the reporters, it's about 25%. It depends, but most publications it's 20%, and that's the figure I've always used, which puts me a little bit in conflict with AALL's collecting of the information, because they'll use just the stated price, which would not be paid by anyone unless they're only buying one supplement.
Well,
So,
it won't be confidential because I'm saying it on camera, but in the years that I was using ALL and some of your information, we found that the prices in the ALL study didn't match up with our own experiences in acquisitions, so we had to basically modify them and go more with your figures than that era, when your figures came along, which wasn't that many years before I actually retired. But we were trying to figure out, well, what should we ask for and why on the increases, and that was useful information to have very much. Yeah.
But at least it's there. If you look on for instance, if you look up the Atlantic Reporter, their website will list every volume and its cost. Of course, you have to know that it's discounted 20%, but
Yeah.
every item is there, and Lexus does not provide that information.
No.
You know, nor does Walters Clore. You know, it's not.
Well, even though the volumes got fatter over the years from West, there did seem to be more of them every year too. And of course, they
Right.
could always blame the courts for that because
Yes.
they were just publishing what the courts were producing. Well, what a marvelous way to shift responsibility
I
to somebody
know.
else for
Yes.
your needing to increase your prices. Well, maybe on that I should ask you sort of the final question that I like to pose. It doesn't necessarily mean you may not want to go on a bit after that, but and that's to ask you, Ken, if there's anything we haven't talked about that you would like to raise before we come to the end of today's conversation.
Well, I guess one of my concerns would be the fact that we need a new generation of law librarians that will take a similar interest in cost-effective issues regarding publications. The thing is, it's become much more complex. There's so many more moving parts now than there were that have to be addressed. And also make an effort to promote that information to their constituencies, whether it's among the professors within a law school or the lawyers in a law firm or the lawyers that practice in a county. Librarians need to make an effort to educate them about publisher practices so that they're not vulnerable. You know, to what extent it will have a positive impact is questionable, but they still need to try to make that effort because the market can only operate effectively, you know, with an informed body of consumers, and that's the problem. You know, it's very strange. I mean, you talk about, and sometimes to use the term monopoly is not really correct because in a strict sense, as long as there are no barriers to entry, that's what they say. But the fact is that the big three have effective control. And it's very difficult for somebody to step in to try to compete with them. Even though nobody's physically stopping them effectively.
The practicalities of it and the costs of getting it started are.
Right.
Presumably,
Yeah. And you know, we've seen some online providers that are providing low-cost online access to legal information that can perhaps help. But you know, if lawyers are used to using Westlaw or Lexis and they feel no inhibition about using it, then the prices will continue to rise.
They may also take an approach that many of us in this country do take, and that is if something is unusually less expensive than something else, there's got to be some reason, and it's not necessarily a good one. And that may be totally false, but you know, you undercut too much, it can become somewhat bad for business.
Right.
And not just because you're not making as much as you might otherwise make.
Yeah.
You're just not credible.
Yeah. So anyway, but I keep this up. You know, I still feel a mission. You know, to keep informing people about this. Oh, and I should have said earlier that my initial thought was not to publish an annual publication because I was thinking, well, that's what the publishers do.
Matthew
you know?
Bender again. But yours doesn't have a
But
lot
I
of
can remember
different
Fritz
information.
Snyder from University of Montana telling me, he says, I hope you're putting this out every year. He loved it so much. You know, he
And
says,
you were wondering,
you can't leave
that
us.
wasn't
you know.
my flat.
Yeah. You know, since I was tracking supplementation costs, you know, he saw the need for it. And I said, yeah, maybe I should do this every year. You
And
know?
then you created a new supplementation cost.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, that was reality.
Yeah, and I'm not immune to the irony of it, you know, but still, it needs to be done, you know. So I'll keep doing it as long as I have my health and, you know.
Great. Maybe on that, Ken, I'll thank you for participating today in today's conversation and contributing to our oral history of our profession and ourselves who were members of it. And in thanking you, I'm thanking you not on my own behalf, but also on behalf of Michelle Wu, Frank Kodak, and Dick Spinelli, with whom I have the honor of working to put together this oral history of law librarianship for the Hein Online database. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for asking me.
Yeah.